have always believed that some doors are meant to stay closed, that some secrets are better left buried in darkness. I should have remembered this simple truth when I moved into that small rental house on Oakwood Drive last winter. The place was a steal, almost suspiciously cheap for the neighborhood. The landlord, Mr. Gaines, seemed anxious to have someone occupy the space, practically thrusting the keys into my hands after I signed the lease. I still remember his parting words as he hurried to his car, not quite meeting my eyes. "There is just one house rule you must follow without exception," he said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "The basement door at the end of the hallway stays locked at all times. Never open it, not even out of curiosity." I nodded, thinking it was just some strange quirk, maybe a storage area for his personal items, or perhaps something simple like old plumbing that could flood. I was a struggling writer looking for solitude and inspiration for my novel, and the thought of a forbidden door honestly seemed like the perfect writing prompt. So I agreed without much thought, laughing it off as I unpacked my meager belongings in what would become my writing sanctuary, completely unaware that I would soon discover the horrifying truth behind his warning. The first few weeks passed without incident. I settled into a comfortable routine, spending my days typing away at my laptop, occasionally stepping out for groceries or coffee. But as January brought heavier snowfall, isolating the house further from the already distant neighbors, I began noticing little things that felt off. It started with the sounds, faint at first, like something solid being dragged across concrete, always around 3 in the morning. I dismissed it as the house settling or pipes expanding in the cold. Then came the distinct smell, musty and metallic, that would sometimes waft through the hallway, especially after rainy days. I placed scented candles around the house, convinced it was just old house dampness. But the dreams were harder to explain away. Vivid nightmares where I would find myself walking down a dark staircase, drawn towards a faint, whimpering sound, only to wake up drenched in sweat just as I reached the bottom step. I found myself increasingly looking at that basement door during my writing breaks, noticing details I had overlooked before, like the unusual reinforcement bolts on the frame and the slightly discolored stains on the lower edge of the wood, stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood droplets that someone had hastily tried to clean. Last night changed everything. A violent thunderstorm knocked out the power around midnight, plunging the house into absolute darkness. Unable to write or distract myself with television, I decided to go to bed early, bundling up under the covers as rain lashed against the windows. I was drifting off when the first thud came, loud enough to jolt me fully awake. It came from below, unmistakably from the basement. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably just something that had fallen over in the storm. Then came another thud, followed by what sounded like fingernails scratching against wood. My heart pounded against my ribs as I grabbed my phone for its flashlight. The rational part of my brain argued that I should just call the landlord or even the police, but curiosity and fear pushed me forward. As I approached the hallway, the scratching grew more frantic, more desperate. There was a moment of silence, then a sound that turned my blood to ice, a weak, raspy voice calling for help. I stood frozen before the basement door, watching with horror as the handle slowly began to turn from the inside, stopping only because of the padlock. Whatever was down there knew I was listening, and it wanted out. I am not proud of what I did next. Instead of calling for help, I found myself searching the kitchen drawers until I found a set of small tools. My hands trembled as I worked on the padlock, telling myself I was just being a good Samaritan, that someone might be trapped and injured. The lock finally gave way with a soft click that seemed to echo through the silent house. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door slowly creaked open by itself, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The stench that hit me was overwhelming, a mixture of decay, waste, and something chemical that burned my nostrils. I should have slammed that door shut, replaced the lock, and run from the house screaming. Instead, I pointed my phone light into the darkness and took my first step down. The stairs groaned beneath my weight as I descended, one careful step at a time. The beam of light revealed concrete walls covered in dark stains that could only be blood, some of it looking disturbingly fresh. Old metal hooks hung from the ceiling, and against one wall stood a table cluttered with rusted tools that belonged in a butcher shop or a torture chamber. My stomach churned as I reached the bottom step and my light caught movement in the far corner. What I saw in that corner will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was human, or at least it had been once. Now it was something broken and twisted, skin pale as paper where it was not marred by cuts and burns. Its limbs were bent at impossible angles, bound with wire that had cut deep into the flesh. The creature turned its face toward my light, revealing empty sockets where eyes should have been. Yet somehow, it sensed me. It smiled, revealing a mouth full of broken teeth filed to points. "I am so glad you came," it whispered in that dry, raspy voice. "He said you would eventually. He always finds curious writers, brings them here, feeds me their fear before their flesh. But I have been so hungry this time." Then I heard the front door open upstairs, followed by the heavy footsteps of my landlord. I now understand the true horror of my situation. The thing in the basement was not the monster, it was the bait. As I stand here writing this warning on my phone, hearing Mr. Gaines coming down the hall, I realize I am trapped between a predator above and its captured prey below. The creature in the corner is laughing softly now, dragging itself toward me, whispering that we will become good friends before the end. I hear the key turning in the door at the top of the stairs. This time, it is being locked with me inside. I will never forget the day I found out my elderly neighbor had a key to my apartment. It happened about 2 weeks after I moved in, when I was still surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and trying to make this new place feel like home. I had just gotten back from grocery shopping and was struggling with my bags when Mrs. Winters appeared in the hallway. She was this fragile-looking woman, probably in her 80s, with paper-thin skin and eyes that seemed too alert for someone her age. She smiled at me and said she had been friends with the previous tenant for years, even had a spare key to water the plants when they were away. She held it up, this ordinary-looking key dangling from her bony fingers, and something about the way she looked at me made my skin crawl. I thanked her for letting me know and told her I would be changing the locks soon, just as a precaution. She nodded and shuffled back to her apartment across the hall, but not before I caught something in her expression, a flicker of what looked like disappointment or maybe even anger. I brushed it off, thinking I was being paranoid. The building manager had mentioned that Mrs. Winters had lived here for decades and was the sweetest person you could meet. Still, I called a locksmith that same afternoon. The new locks were installed the next day, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me when I heard that satisfying click of a brand new deadbolt sliding into place. I remember thinking that was the end of it. Looking back now, I realized that was actually when everything started. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I convinced myself I was imagining things. I came home from work and found my coffee mug on the kitchen counter, instead of in the sink where I had left it that morning. Clean, dry, placed perfectly in the center of the counter. I stood there staring at it, trying to remember if I had washed it before leaving. Then there was the bathroom towel that was folded differently, the blinds that were adjusted to a different height, the thermostat that was set 2 degrees cooler than I normally kept it. All small things, things I could easily explain away as forgetfulness or stress from the new job and apartment. But they kept happening, these tiny disruptions to my space, these small signs that something was not quite right. I started taking pictures of how I left things before going out, checking them when I returned, confirming my suspicions. Someone was coming into my apartment while I was gone. I went to the building manager, showed him the evidence, but he looked at me like I was crazy. He assured me no one had a master key except him, and he certainly had not been in my unit. He suggested I might be under a lot of stress from the move. Maybe I was sleepwalking, or maybe I just had a bad memory. I nodded and smiled and pretended to agree with him, but inside I was screaming. I knew I was not crazy. I knew someone had been in my apartment, so I set up a cheap camera, hidden on my bookshelf, pointed at the front door. The footage I reviewed that night changed everything. The video quality was grainy, but there was no mistaking what I was seeing. At 2:17 p.m., while I was at work, my front door opened. The new locks I had installed, the ones that were supposed to keep me safe, did nothing to stop whoever had a key. And there she was, Mrs. Winters, my elderly neighbor, creeping into my apartment with slow, deliberate movements that seemed at odds with how frail she appeared in the hallway. She moved through my living room with a familiarity that made my blood run cold, trailing her fingers across my furniture, picking up and examining my belongings, opening drawers and cabinets. But the most disturbing part was when she went into my bedroom and stayed there for nearly 40 minutes. The camera could not see what she was doing in there, but when she finally emerged, she was smiling. Not the warm smile of a sweet old lady, but something else entirely. Something that made me feel physically ill as I watched the footage. Before leaving, she stood in the center of my living room, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath, as if she was inhaling the essence of my home, of me. Then she left, carefully locking the door behind her. I sat in the dark for hours after watching that video, paralyzed with fear and confusion. I did not understand why she was doing this, or how she had a key that worked with my new locks. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my elderly neighbor was sneaking into my apartment to stand in my bedroom and smell my air? I needed more evidence, something concrete. I decided to confront her myself the next day, but she was not home when I knocked, or at least, she did not answer. I changed the locks again, this time using a different locksmith and the most expensive, high-security system they offered. I did not tell the building manager. I did not tell anyone. I just wanted to feel safe in my own home again. For 3 days, nothing happened. No more strange displacements of my belongings. No more feeling like someone had been there while I was gone. I started to relax, to think that maybe Mrs. Winters had gotten the message when she found her key no longer worked. Then came the night that still haunts my dreams, the night I realized this was about something far more sinister than an old woman with boundary issues. I was alone in my apartment, working late on my laptop. The building was quiet, most of my neighbors already asleep. It was almost midnight when I heard it, the soft sound of metal sliding into metal. Someone was putting a key into my front door lock. I froze, barely breathing, as I heard the key turn, but nothing happened. The new locks had held. Then came another attempt, the key twisting more forcefully this time, rattling the door slightly. And another, and another. For almost 20 minutes the sound continued, growing increasingly desperate and aggressive. I sat there, paralyzed, phone in hand but too terrified to call for help, because what if the police came and found nothing but a confused old woman? What if they thought I was the problem? The scratching at the lock continued for hours, occasionally stopping for a few minutes before resuming with renewed intensity. Sometimes it sounded like fingernails instead of a key, scraping and clawing at the wood and metal. And then, worst of all, I began to hear whispering from the other side of the door. Too quiet to make out the words, but definitely a voice, definitely her voice. Morning came after the longest night of my life. The scratching had finally stopped around 4 a.m., and I had sat huddled on my couch until the first rays of sunlight broke through my window. I approached my front door cautiously, half expecting to find it damaged from the hours of attempted entry. What I found instead was far worse. The door was completely unmarked, with no scratches around the lock, no evidence at all of the hours of assault it had endured. But on the floor just inside my door was a small white envelope that had been slipped underneath. My name was written on it in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. I opened it with trembling fingers and found a single sheet of paper inside with just 3 words. "I miss you." That was when I knew I had to get out. I packed a bag, called in sick to work, and fled to a hotel across town. I spent the day researching the building and the previous tenant of my apartment. What I discovered made my blood freeze in my veins. The previous tenant, a young woman named Sarah, had lived there for just 6 months before she disappeared without a trace. The police investigation had turned up nothing. No body, no evidence of foul play. She had simply vanished, leaving all her belongings behind. According to old news articles, the last person to see her was her elderly neighbor, who told police that Sarah had mentioned going on a trip. The most disturbing part was the photo of Sarah in one of the articles. She looked remarkably like me. Same hair color, same build, similar features. I was her replacement, not just in the apartment, but in some twisted fantasy of Mrs. Winters. I knew then that I could never go back. But I did go back, one last time, armed with knowledge and a plan. I waited until I was sure Mrs. Winters had left for her weekly church meeting, information I had gleaned from the building manager under the pretense of wanting to apologize for accusing her. I entered my apartment, packed what I could in 2 large suitcases, and then did what I had come to do. I picked the lock on Mrs. Winters' apartment, a skill I had frantically learned via online tutorials during my hotel stay. What I found inside explained everything. The walls were covered with photos, hundreds of them, of young women who all shared similar features, similar builds. Some of the photos dated back decades, yellowed with age. And there I was, the newest addition, photos of me sleeping, showering, eating, photos that could only have been taken from inside my apartment. But the most horrifying discovery was in her bedroom. A collection of personal items taken from each woman, arranged like trophies. Hairbrushes with strands still caught in the bristles, toothbrushes, worn clothing, journals, and a small wooden box containing house keys, dozens of them, each with a name tag. Mine was there too, both the original and somehow a copy of my new key. I took my photos, took the keys, and was about to leave when something caught my eye. A door, hidden behind a heavy curtain. I wish I had never opened it. I wish I could erase what I found there. But now I know where all those women went, why they disappeared. I know what happens when Mrs. Winters decides you are perfect, when she decides she loves you too much to let you leave. The police did not believe me at first, not until they opened that hidden room and found the remains. They tell me she will never get out of prison, that I am safe now. But I still check my new locks every night, still wake up hearing the sound of a key turning, the sound of someone who loves you too much trying to come home. I have always enjoyed living alone, the quiet, the freedom, the sense of control over my space. When I found a small rental house in a quiet town, it felt perfect. It was old but cozy, the kind of place where you could hear the wooden floors creak under your footsteps. The landlord barely spoke when I signed the lease, just handed me the keys and muttered that he hoped I would not mind the noises. At first, I thought he meant the occasional groan of an aging house settling into itself. But the first night, I woke up shivering. The air inside my bedroom was freezing, even though the heater was on. I pulled the blanket tighter around myself and tried to ignore it. The next night, I heard faint sounds from above, a soft creaking, like someone shifting their weight on the attic floor. I told myself it was just the wind, that old houses always made strange noises. But in the morning, I found my bedroom door wide open. I was sure I had closed it before going to bed. The feeling of control I once loved about living alone started to slip away. The little things kept happening. My keys were not where I left them. My chair was slightly pulled out from my desk when I had pushed it in. One morning, I found all the cabinets in the kitchen slightly open. I tried to convince myself I had done it without thinking, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then came the footsteps. They started at night, soft and deliberate, moving slowly across the attic. I laid in bed, heart pounding, waiting for them to stop. Some nights, they did. Other nights, they seemed to pause right above me, as if someone was standing still, listening. I called the landlord, but he dismissed my concerns, saying no one had lived there before me for a long time. I considered moving out, but I had no savings for another deposit, so I stayed, and things only got worse. One night I heard breathing, not my own, a slow, shallow breath coming from just outside my bedroom door. That was the night I decided to install cameras. If someone was sneaking into my house, I needed proof. I set them up in the living room, the hallway, and my bedroom, pointing straight at my bed. I told myself it would help me feel safer. Instead, it did the opposite. The first few nights, I saw nothing unusual, just me, shifting in my sleep. But on the fourth night, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. At around 3 in the morning, the attic hatch in the hallway slid open. A thin, bony hand reached down, followed by a face that looked like stretched wax, its eyes sunken deep into its skull. It did not climb down like a normal person. It crawled. Its limbs moved unnaturally, pulling its body across the ceiling like an insect. It stopped at my bedroom door, tilting its head, listening. Then, it slithered inside. I watched, frozen, as it crouched beside my bed, its pale face inches from mine. It stayed there for hours, just watching. Its breathing was slow, controlled, like it was savoring the moment. Then, just as the sky began to lighten, it slithered back, disappearing into the attic. I wanted to believe it was some kind of glitch, a trick of the camera, but deep down, I knew better. I barely slept that day. Every sound in the house made me jump. I kept staring at the attic hatch, knowing that whatever lived up there would come down again. I should have left. I should have packed my things and never looked back. But I needed to know how long this had been happening. How many nights had I slept while something watched me from the dark? The next night, I kept the lights on and sat in bed, staring at the attic hatch. I did not sleep. I did not move. I just waited. And at exactly 3 in the morning, it began again. The slow creak of the hatch sliding open, the soft thud of something dropping onto the floor. Then, the crawl, that sickening, deliberate movement as it pulled itself toward my room. But this time, I was awake. This time, I saw it with my own eyes. The gaunt figure slithered inside, its hollow eyes locking onto me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, its lips pulled into a slow, unnatural smile. It had known I was watching. It had always known. I ran. I did not pack. I did not look back. I just grabbed my keys and drove until my hands stopped shaking. When I called the police, they searched the house and found the attic nearly empty. Just a thin, dirty mattress, a pile of old clothes, and dozens of empty food wrappers. The landlord never spoke about it, just muttered that he hoped I had not recorded anything. I never went back for my things. I never wanted to know what would have happened if I had woken up earlier, if I had seen it before I installed the cameras. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I cannot help but wonder, how long had it been watching me before I noticed?